I wish to extend a personal welcome here tonight to Professor Skinner. There has been general agreement among humanists on most of the main principles of the humanist philosophy. Now Professor Skinner raises an important point of disagreement with me and other humanists on the question of free choice and determinism. I am very grateful to him for bringing to the front pages one of my favorite philosophic issues. And this is going to be something that will enliven humanist gatherings for the next 50 years or so. We're going to have that dialogue on determinism and free choice, and it's going to be good for the American Humanist Association and good for the humanist movement in general. Thank you.
Burrhus Frederic Skinner was born in 1904 in a small railroad town in Pennsylvania. He lived in the same house, not far from both sets of grandparents, until he went to college. And he went through 12 grades in the same public school. His family sent him to Sunday school and taught him to fear God, the police, and what people will think. He studied the piano and saxophone and played in the jazz band. In his spare time, he explored the countryside, built all kinds of gadgets, and tried to design a perpetual motion machine. He majored in English literature at Hamilton College in New York. His father wanted him to study law, but agreed to let him try writing for a while. His efforts were not successful and left him disappointed in literature, but undecided about any other career. In college, he had studied biology, and a friend had told him, "Science is the art of the 20th century." While working in a Greenwich Village bookstore, he read Pavlov, Watson, and Bertrand Russell on Watson, and turned to behavioristic psychology. He went to Harvard for his PhD. After teaching 9 years at Minnesota and 3 years as chairman of the Department of Psychology at Indiana, he returned to Harvard permanently. He lives in Cambridge with his wife, Eve. In 1938, he published The Behavior of Organisms, based upon the doctoral research that began his life work in the experimental analysis of behavior. Going beyond Pavlov, he studied so-called voluntary behavior, emphasizing the measurement of rates of response and the effects of contingencies of reinforcement. With his method, which he called operant conditioning, others could repeat and extend his experiments, and they did. 30 years later, hundreds of laboratories are studying operant behavior. Operant conditioning is used in studying the effects of drugs, training the mentally retarded, retraining psychotics and convicts, designing instructional devices and materials, and in behavior modification therapy. Skinner is the inventor of a teaching machine, the Skinner box for laboratory studies of animal learning, and the air crib used by his daughter Deborah and thousands of babies since, including his daughter Julie's 2 babies. His many articles and books include 2 bestsellers, the utopian novel, Walden 2 in 1948, and Beyond Freedom and Dignity in 1971. Both stirred up debate over the apparent conflict between Skinner's behaviorism and traditional humanism, a question Skinner will address tonight. He has received many honorary degrees and awards. In 1971, 2 more were added. The Joseph P. Kennedy Foundation for Mental Retardation gave him their International Award. and the American Psychological Foundation awarded him their gold medal for a distinguished record of scientific and scholarly achievement. Critics like to point out how hard it is to see how simple laws of learning could account for Skinner's own remarkable behavior. In his scientific memoir, Skinner has helpfully tried to trace some of the factors in his development, from a chance early exposure to the writing of Francis Bacon, to some performing pigeons he happened to see at a county fair. He admits, though, that it is impossible to identify with any certainty all of the relevant variables in past events. In his own case, the sources of his achievements are still mysterious enough to arouse our admiration. I am happy to present to Professor Skinner the Humanist of the Year Award for 1972.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erdman. I'm very happy to receive this, and it came just the right time. It is very reinforcing, but I'm always bothered about the contingencies. However, as many of you know, I've taken something of a beating from my critics for the past 6 or 8 months. I have no doubt that many eyebrows were raised when this award was announced, and I dare say there will be some resignations from the American Humanist Association in consequence. But it is good for me because I have, I think, felt some of the criticism, and I take this to mean that in general, the American Humanist Association is on my side.
Professor Skinner's subject tonight is humanism and behaviorism. Professor Skinner.
There are 2 ways in which one may try to know another person. One of them is associated with existentialism, phenomenology, and structuralism. It's concerned with what another person is, or if he is changing, what he is coming to be or becoming. We try to know another person in this sense as we know ourselves. We try through empathy or sympathy to understand how another person feels. Through intuition, we try to discover what he is thinking. We try to communicate with him in the etymological sense of making our feelings and ideas common through both of us. We engage in a dialogue. We try to establish good interpersonal relations. This is a kind of passive, contemplative knowing about another person. If we are concerned with what he's going to do, we assume that, like ourselves, he will behave in a given way because of what he is. His feelings or his states of mind will determine his behavior. The other way is associated with behaviorism, and it is a matter of what another person does. Now, this we can observe directly without some special kind of knowing. And when we try to explain why a person behaves as he does, we look not at his states of mind or feelings, but at what has happened in the past in 2 kinds of environments. The environment in which the species evolved over millions of years, and which is responsible for the species as it now exists and what we call its genetic endowment, and the personal environment of the individual. which modifies that genetic endowment and converts the organism, the biological organism, into a person, an organism with an elaborate behavioral repertoire. Now you might ask whether the behavioral account is complete or whether the existential account isn't a necessary supplement. After all, there are certain temporal and spatial gaps between the environment and the observed effects on behavior. We recognize this when we talk about genetic endowment. The environment responsible for that is long since past, and we take the current state of the individual as a record of what happened at that time. Why should we not do the same for the history of the individual? We reinforce a person today and we observe a change in his behavior tomorrow. What has happened in between? Clearly, we brought about a change in him when we reinforced his behavior, a change in what he is. We have modified that genetic endowment and can now call it something else. An omniscient physiologist would be able to tell us all the details. He would see the changes going on in the organism when we reinforce, and he would be able to explain how that changed organism now behaves in a different way later. Is not, therefore, the existentialist or phenomenological account a necessary mediating stage in the whole sequence of environment, organism, and behavior? A dualist would say no, because he would believe the states of mind and feelings exist in a different universe. But isn't it true that when we have feelings, we are feeling conditions in our own bodies, and then when we introspect, see our purposes, our intentions, our attitudes, and so on, we are also observing something about our bodies, which are the things which are the product of what has happened to us. The physiologist would be able then to give an account of this middle stage, and it could be argued that through introspection or through ordinary feeling of our own bodies, we ourselves supply that missing link. But let's look at how and why we do observe our own bodies in this sense. There's no question that each of us contains within his skin part of the universe. It is not therefore different from any other part of the universe, but it is private. The person has direct contact with that part of the universe which is denied to anyone else. And the behaviorist never denies that privacy. He simply raises questions about how it can come to be known. Now, we do have nerves going to different parts of our bodies. There are interoceptive nervous systems which are in contact with conditions which arise in emotion, states of deprivation, which are very useful to the individual. There are other stimuli generated by posture and movement in the proprioceptive nervous system, without which we could hardly behave in a coordinated manner. And our exteroceptive nervous system, the system that we use with respect to the world around us, also figures in self-knowledge or awareness. But knowing is more than simply responding to stimuli of that sort. The child responds to color, distinguishes between things on the basis of color before he knows his colors. He comes to know his colors as verbal behavior, and that can only come about when a social environment, a verbal community, reinforces some responses and not others, and sets up a whole descriptive repertoire with which the individual can report the existence of a color apart from a practical situation in which action is taken. Now, this is true about the conditions in our own bodies, and I have pointed out elsewhere how difficult it is for the verbal community to differentially reinforce correctly the kinds of words we use in describing what is going on when we have feelings or states of mind. The community does not know about these private conditions and cannot correctly reinforce the behavior which is descriptive of them. So that all our vocabulary in talking about ourselves tends to be imprecise. And of course, in trying to know about another person, our repertoire is even less precise. But there is a much more important point. What can be known about our bodies when we are aware of what we are doing? We can know what we are in contact with through the nervous systems which have arisen for practical purposes, which have evolved in the evolution of the species for the sake of coordinated action and the internal economy of a person's body. But the kinds of reports which the verbal environment might want us to make should depend upon systems which are actually not available. The new contingencies, the social contingencies, have existed for far too short a period of time to be effective in evolution. We have not had the time to evolve with the kinds of nervous systems we should like in order to answer the questions that people will ask. So they ask only those questions for which they can get answers. Such things as, do you see that? Can you hear that? Did you see it? Did you hear it? And so on. And we answer those questions by reporting on the activity of our sense organs with respect to the external environment. They ask, are you hungry? Are you angry? And so on. And we can answer those questions rather inaccurately in terms of states of our bodies which are associated with these conditions. They can ask, do you want to go? Shall we go? Do you like that? Are you interested in going? And so on. And these are questions concerned with the probability of behavior, and we can answer that in terms of available nervous systems. We can observe our own tendencies to behave, and we can report stimuli that we have received. But all such questions are about stimuli and responses. They are not about the mediating processes in the nervous system which the omniscient physiologist will eventually come into contact with. What we observe when we have feelings and introspect are actually a rather miscellaneous set of byproducts of the environmental circumstances to which our behavior is related. Our feelings are not the causes of our behavior. Our intentions, our inclinations are not causes. Our purposes are not causes. They are byproducts, and rather miscellaneous ones at that. They are certainly not the mediating stage between the environment and the behavior which is a function of it. Now, do I really mean to say that Plato's discovery of the mind didn't amount to much, or that Aquinas or Locke or Descartes or Kant had nothing much on the ball, or that introspective psychology was not really concerned with the mind, or that James or Freud were not really talking about things that are important with respect to our mental life, our inclinations to behave? Yes, I am inclined to say all of that. is really a waste of time. Because but if that is the case, why have people spent so much time on it? I think there are good answers to that. These things we feel in our own bodies when we are behaving or about to behave are quite salient. They are here and now. Whereas our environmental histories, our past history, they have happened. We could not observe much of them. We probably did not observe much, and we have forgotten much of what we observed. So that if someone asks you something about why you were going to do something, it's very easy for you to report on the current state of your body. It's very hard for you to tell them what happened to you which is related to the behavior. Moreover, these internal states occur in a time and place which would be quite plausibly thought of as the time and place for causes. We often think of something to do before we do it. It looks as if our thinking was a kind of cause of action. We are said to have ideas before we express them. We are inclined to do something before we actually do it. Now, this is an actual temporal connection upon some occasions, but not all. Most of the time when we're talking, we don't actually say it to ourselves before we say it aloud. The behavior just occurs to us. And when it doesn't, when it occurs to us silently first, it is still nothing but behavior. It is not a prior cause of the behavior. Moreover, this privacy, plus our neglect of the causal circumstances in our past history, leads to the notion that there is somehow or other a separate, controlling, internal self. People will say, yes, but there is an I who knows what I am going to do next. And that is true. The I that knows what it is going to do next is the organism up to that point with all its history up to that point. But that isn't enough for most people. They want the internal agent to be making decisions, making choices, willing to act, and so on. Now, it is correct to say, I think, that we make choices in that sense, or decide to act or act, if we are talking about the whole organism. I don't mean to imply that there is any freedom even so, but there is an origination. Something starts at a given point, so far as we are concerned. We see ourselves engaging in behavior, and we are likely to neglect the reasons why we do so. There is no true inner direction, no true initiation or origination. Well, people will then point to novel behavior and say, what about that? How can you explain creative behavior? How can you explain the fact that the child begins to emit sentences that he has never heard and has never spoken before and could not have been taught to say on any stimulus-response model? Well, the answer to that is that I'm not talking about a stimulus-response model. I'm talking about operant conditioning, which is a matter of selection by consequences. And the very same issue of creation or creativity came up in a very similar set of circumstances about 100 and some years ago. This was the theory of evolution. Prior to Darwin, you could point to the millions of different creatures alive on the surface of the earth as evidence of a creative mind. Someone in advance had a design, a plan, and constructed creatures accordingly. Darwin moved the creativity to after the fact, through the selection of mutations. And operant conditioning is a matter of the selection of forms of behavior through contingencies of reinforcement, where Darwin was talking about contingencies of survival, and in the same way we can demonstrate the likelihood that original forms of behavior will occur, and we must therefore displace once again the notion of a creative mind. Now, it's rather curious that we have allowed creative mind with a capital M to go by the board, but we're still fighting desperately to defend and maintain the doctrine that each of us possesses his own creative mind, which is responsible for his behavior. The behavioral analysis does handle the kinds of behavior attributed to the self, and it handles the behavior attributed to multiple selves. Because what is involved here is simply the contingencies of reinforcement which shape repertoires of behavior. By shifting to the environment, however, something happens to the notion of a self, and it is thought that a behavioristic analysis is somehow or other destroying man qua man, or dehumanizing man, taking out of the individual something that we have regarded as essentially human. As I pointed out elsewhere, a scientific analysis does not dehumanize man, it dehomunculizes him. The homunculus was a medieval expression for the little man inside who did all of this kind of thing and ran the body from a position of an internal director of some kind. It is true that a behavioristic analysis treats man as an object. He is an object, a biological object, an organism, but an extraordinarily complex one which can acquire that extremely subtle repertoire of behavior which converts an object, an organism into a person. Now, when you say that, when you talk about man as an object, it sounds as if you were giving up the whole question of values. And there have been criticisms that behaviorism pretends to be a value-free science, and yet the human situation today demands a science which is full of values, which takes the human condition today as its important object. That cannot be value-free. Well, I think that situation is not too complex. An experimental analysis of behavior can be value-free. You can set up experiments, carry them out, and get results without making any judgment about what is good for you as an experimenter or the organism or people in general or what use will be made of your results. But a technology of behavior derived from that laboratory work must take values into account. It must look at what is happening when it is being applied. And unlike behavioral technologies, it has built into it the very means of making that kind of value judgments. Values can be studied. They are aspects of human behavior. The things people call good are not good because they feel good or taste good or look good. They are good because of the human genetic endowment. People call things good not because they feel good or look good, but because it has been important to the human race that things be reinforcing during the evolution of the species. At one time it was extremely important that men and women be reinforced by certain kinds of foodstuffs in the mouth because they were nutritious, sweets and salt and so on, and these things were in short supply, and it was important to remember where you found such a thing or how to catch such a thing. And these things then became extremely reinforcing. It was important that sexual contact be reinforcing because until fairly recently, when the human population was decimated with pestilence and famine, it was important that people breed at every opportunity. And so we have an enormous capacity to be reinforced by sexual contact. Surely it feels good, but it isn't reinforcing because it feels good. It feels good because it's reinforcing. And that is the important fact. Then people create reinforcers in order to induce others to behave to reinforce them. The social goods, approval, affection, attention, and so on. We can study how this is done, how it arises. And we can also look at those social contingencies which are used to prevent people from mistreating others. There was a recent conference in New York, a confrontation between humanists and Catholics, in which the whole issue of conscience was debated. And there was the tendency was to argue that the conscience begins as some kind of feeling of right and wrong. And to my dismay, I found that people in the conference were unwilling to look beyond these feelings. That you start with a feeling that certain things are right or wrong. I want to look at the sanctions, the punitive sanctions that people impose upon each other to keep them behaving well with respect to each other. In a symposium at the Kennedy Foundation, I argued that the 5 great classical examples of the mistreatment of people can be analyzed this way. Small children in orphanages and the schools that Charles Dickens described, old people in homes, prisoners, psychotics, and retarders. These have, for hundreds of years, been the archetypal patterns of mistreatment of human beings. And if you say, well, that must be because those in these places lacked compassion or benevolence or had no conscience, you're quite wrong. They are mistreated because they cannot fight back. It's as simple as that. Children are too small, old people are too weak, prisoners have to fight against guns, that psychotics and retardates can't organize and can't act skillfully if they did organize. The reason the mistreatment occurs is not a lack of conscience on anyone's part, it's a lack of counter-control, a lack of sanctions imposed by other people to make sure that they will not be mistreated. So here again, you are trying to put into the inner man, in the sense of benevolence or conscience, something which can be taken out and analyzed in terms of external sanction. Now, this is particularly the case where there are conflicting values, and these are reducible to conflicting contingencies of reinforcement and punishment. The science of behavior could almost be called a science of values. We are concerned with their effects. Ethics and morals are mainly a matter of the conflicts which arise when immediate consequences conflict with deferred consequences. How do you forego that pleasure now for the sake of a greater good, or to avoid an ultimate punishment? Or how do you take that punishment now for the sake of a remote good, and so on? These are characteristic patterns. They can all be studied experimentally, and they are fundamental issues with respect to values. So that the science of behavior, far from neglecting values, is, as far as I can see, the only direct approach to understanding what they are all about. Now, there is a special kind of value which has nothing to do with the individual or with the good of others in the sense of the greatest good for the greatest number. It has to do with the survival of the culture, or ultimately with the survival of the human race. The culture is nothing more than a social environment, and in it people acquire much of their behavioral repertoires. The strength of the culture in solving its problems will depend upon the behavior it encourages and sets up in its members. A culture which induces its members to behave in effective ways will be a stronger culture. And practices then survive with the culture, with the people who practice them. This is a kind of evolution, very much like the Darwinian evolution, very much like upward conditioning. It is a matter, again, of selection by consequences. It does not imply a prior design or intention or purpose. Purpose is moved to the consequences. Now, until recently, this was all a process of evolution under contingencies of survival. Cultures would hit upon new ways of doing things, new ways of organizing families or raising children or paying wages or collecting taxes and so on. Some of these work, and the culture was better off because of that, and the culture survived and the practice survived. Some of them did not. There is a kind of evolution going on at the present time. Our practices are being tested, and whether this culture is here tomorrow will depend upon whether we are actually now employing the best possible set of practices. However, we have also reached the point at which we can design a culture to make it more effective. The geneticists are already talking about redesigning the human genetic endowment. We can redesign the behavior of an individual by changing the contingencies of reinforcement under which he lives, and we can, to some extent, redesign a culture. So we can set up new practices, decide that there are better ways of doing things than the way we're doing them now, and try them out, so that it is possible not simply to allow the evolution of culture to proceed, but to interfere, to do something about it, to accelerate the process. And that will be done by those people whom the culture has induced to take an interest in its future. We aren't all born interested in whether our culture survives or not. It has to be done by specific devices, ways in which the culture induces its members to take its future into account. It's usually done with other jingoistic devices. Rome convinced the Romans that it was sweet and decorous to die for Rome. It was great for Rome, but not very good for the Romans. The church made martyrdom heaven was contingent upon martyrdom. People were seeking martyrdom at one stage. That was great for the church, but not so good for the martyr. And those are techniques which have been worked out from time to time. How are we to get the individual to take an interest not only in his own culture, in a jingoistic sense, but in the ultimate good of mankind as a whole? This is a problem which calls for a very careful analysis of reasons why people behave as they do and ways in which cultures can induce people to behave in different ways. Necessarily have to be done by any prior design. It can be an accidental process. Once the stage has been reached at which we can begin to design, then something else arises. And I think that this is the natural place for a humanistic activity. A humanist seems to me to be one of those whom the culture is made interested in its future. And I don't mean a jingoistic future of a given culture. I mean the future of mankind. You take mankind into account only if you are induced to do so. We have just reached that stage in cultures where people do this. We are very bad at doing it now. We do not induce very many people to take the future of their own way of life into account, let alone the future of the human race. But it is something which can be done. It will not be done by changing people. That is a genetic problem, and the geneticists are not yet up to it. It is done by changing the world in which people live, to produce a better culture in the sense of a better environment, which will generate much more effective behavior in those living in the culture. Now, there is here a strong contrast between this kind of contribution, which I believe a behavioral analysis can make, and another movement which has turned up recently in psychology in America called Humanistic Psychology. I resent this appropriation of the word humanistic, and I want to tell you why. This is often referred to as a third force, meaning something in addition to behaviorism and psychoanalysis. But third must not be supposed to mean advanced, nor should force be supposed to mean power. Behaviorism and psychoanalysis are both deterministic systems. Freud was a determinist. The humanistic psychologist therefore emphasizes autonomous man. Man is going to transcend his environment, transcend his genetic endowment. Man is going to determine what stimuli will get through to him and what he's going to leave out and all of this. The word autonomy sums it up. The humanist is interested in autonomous man. Now, the movement is, of course, most intimately at home with existentialism, phenomenology, and structuralism. What a person is what the humanistic psychologist is concerned with. Actually, it seems to me this is a throwback. It's returning to a very early attitude toward human behavior before anything was known about the role of the environment in the determination of conduct. Moreover, since it does neglect the environment, I think it poses a real threat. Maslow's term, which is the dominating principle in humanistic psychology, is self-actualization, self-fulfillment. The individual is to grow, to develop, and to achieve all that he is capable of achieving. But why this emphasis on the self? Isn't that really a selfish view? You can take political, religious, and economic freedom as your goal, and you will, if you are wise, strengthen the individual against despotic control in those areas. That has been the history of the struggle for freedom. You convince the individual that he is the source of the power used to govern him, that he is being governed by his consent. You convince the worker that he is producing the very wealth which is used to pay him wages, and so on. This is all to the good, but it can go too far. It can lead to the aggrandizement of the individual, which in turn then breeds a new kind of despotism. For example, the American right of the individual to acquire vast sums of money, which he can then use entirely in his own interest, is a type of tyranny arising from the notion of the rights of the individual and individual freedom. And the Hindu concern for personal growth, the struggle of the spirit to approach some remote goal, this has led to a social chaos which is evident enough to anyone who visits India. These are exaggerations of the importance of the individual, which in the long run do not solve the original problem for which the individual is strengthened, but indeed work against it. Behaviorism, and I believe humanism, should be concerned with the aggrandizement of mankind, not of any individual member. Behaviorism has already demonstrated its power to do the kinds of things that we all know should be done. It has made important contributions in psychotherapy and the care of the retardate. As Dr. Erdman said, it has made differences in child care, in education, in incentive systems, in penal reform, and so on. These are genuine achievements at the present time. They're not all I would like to see, and that's my complaint. I think there are reasons why these things are not developing more rapidly, and the reasons are just the kinds of things I'm talking about tonight. But there's no doubt that the behavioral analysis is working. It is taking mankind bit by bit, or group by group, into account and doing something about it. This is not a concern for individual gratification, or even just for the good of others in the sense of the greatest good for the greatest number. It is a concern with mankind as a whole, with the design of the most effective environment to bring out all that man is capable of. It emphasizes the environment, of course, and throws new light on it and on the evolution of cultures. It is a new technology for doing something about the human condition, not to aggrandize any individual, but to build the kind of world in which every individual can develop to the fullest extent of his genetic endowment, which at the present time is never realized even to a very small fraction of its actual worth. And anyone who looks at the world today knows that a great deal needs to be done. We are threatened by problems which are no longer of concern to any one group, any one nation, any one social system, any one culture, any one economic system. The nuclear holocaust the exhaustion of resources in the world, pollution of the environment, all of this going back to overpopulation. These are the things which need to be done. They're not going to be done by philosophies which merely speak of the actualization of the individual. They're going to be concerned not with the kind of knowing which comes about in a face-to-face effort to sympathize with, empathize with, intuit feelings of another person. These problems will be met, and I think eventually solved by the second way of knowing, by an emphasis on what people do and the reasons why they do them. There's a great deal to be done. It seems to me that man is the measure of all things. We are all concerned for man, and that this means man in general, mankind, other than any individual. And if we hope to make the kinds of changes which need to be made, and most of them are pretty obvious now, we need all we can possibly learn about human behavior. And that has a background the behavior of other species, but eventually, of course, no one is interested in pigeons or rats. It's the human organism which is important, and it is that organism which is going to be changed by the construction of a different kind of world. This seems to me to be a program which is at the very heart of humanism, seems to me to be essentially a program of behavioristic analysis, and I welcome this opportunity to try to demonstrate to you that behaviorism is a humanistic psychology. Thank you very much.
This program was produced by KPFA, Pacifica Radio in Northern California, and distributed by Pacifica Program Service in Berkeley. All rights are reserved.